Hey, welcome back to the 167. If you're joining us on YouTube or Right Now Media, the video went absolutely haywire this week. So you can continue on. We have the audio only here for the video, or you can head on over and find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and just check out the audio. But thanks for bearing with us. We'll be back next week with full video. Thanks. Hey, thanks for joining us on the 167. Today is part 2 where we're talking about Joshua crossing into the promised land. Welcome to the 167. Hey, welcome to the 167. I'm here with Pastor Rick George.
Hey, good morning.
I almost said of New Life Community Church, but
That's a given.
it's a given. I'm Lucas Smiley, I'm discipleship pastor here. Hey, we're so glad to be back with you. We're in this series, I Love My Church, and we've been sharing every week something about that you love about your church. So I love my church because
my church loves people. So we just went through a kind of a hard weekend where one of our family members died very unexpectedly, and just watching how our church family reached out and just loved that family through a difficult time and continues to do so. But just those connections and the way we love. And I know it's not just unique to New Life Community Church. There are other places that love well, but it's just something I love about our church, that we love other people.
Well, and I'll send some love out to our meals ministry, which is kind of one of our unsung heroes.
Yep.
That, you know, I've talked to that family that they had a member pass, and then I had a couple other families that this week have gone through miscarriage, and we just even yesterday had an incident where someone in the community of Gardner had unfortunately chosen to take their own life.
Yep.
But their wife is in one of our Bible studies. They don't even really come to church here, but she comes to our Rooted Bible study, and they've already made a call out to the meals ministry. The women in that Bible study have already arranged meals. We had 2 other people this week that got sick through life groups, and I talked to them, they're like, our fridge is stocked. You know, people are here at our house. And I'm like, okay.
Yep, we do. Yep, one of the things that we do well, and I love that about our church.
So I love being able to show up and like, the pastor is here, and really I'm like the 5th person on the scene.
Yeah, exactly.
So we do a good job of that. So this week, that was a great message. We're still talking about Joshua crossing the Jordan River into the promised land to take the promised land. And you asked us the question, are you willing to fight?
Yeah. So the reason that I asked that question is, like, I've heard people, I've wrestled with the idea that when God said, I'm going to give you the promised land, that I think a lot of people think, well, it's like Christmas Day. You know, they wake up and God says, here's the promised land. And you open it, and it's just like a gift. And it wasn't exactly like that. They had to cross the Jordan River, which was an obstacle keeping them from the promise. But then the promise, they were going to have to fight for that land. The people who were in the land were not going to give it up easily. It's no different than, like, currently, in Israel, where the temple should be is not possessed by or occupied by the Jews. It's not God's people. It's somebody else has taken up residence, and to take that land back would come at a fight. And so that's what they were facing, is a group of folks that said, no, you might want this land, but we're here. And they're like, yeah, but God gave it to us. And they're like, we don't care. And so,
who is this God you speak of?
And so sometimes when God says, here's what I have for you, we have to not just say, okay, and claim it, but we have to fight to receive it. Mm-hmm. And that's where the question comes, are you willing to fight? Like, are you willing to fight? Like most people would say, yeah, I'm willing to fight for my marriage. Right? I'll fight. I know it's a struggle, but I'll fight for my marriage. I'll fight for my kids. I'll, fight. There's a few things, and then everything else is like, I don't know that I'm willing to fight for that. So the question is, are you willing to fight for what God has for you? And some people will say yes, and some people will say no. And the truth is, some of us will say, yes, I'm willing to fight until the fight starts. And you're like, no, I don't really want to do this because it's hard.
Well, I think, for us and our family, for Carissa and I, that is never more evident than probably in parenting our children is, you start off as a parent and you're like, you have all these ideas where like, our kids will never do this and they'll never do this and we'll never, and it's like, and then all of their friends are doing it. They bug you every day to do it. And you start to go, is this really worth, and
I'm going to have to choose my battles. And
right. And I think that is a true phrase when people are like, oh, you got to pick your battles. I'm like, I think that is true. But also there are some things that I'm like, oh no, absolutely. Like this is a battle that is worth fighting.
Right.
Like for our children right now, it's, you could say it's cell phones or it's whatever, but it's really the use of the internet is teaching them to use the internet safely where, I see a lot of parents just hand their kids, not just phones, but tablets, laptops, whatever, unfettered access to the internet and say, good luck to you. And I'm like that. And, that is a daily fight at our house of why that's not okay. And it's awful because you have to put parental controls and you have to like model it. And like as a parent, you can't be on your phone all the time because and your kids see that. And then they're like, well, you're on your phone all the time. It's like, it's this huge battle. And, and that's just one of the, like the internet is just one thing with your kids where it's every day there's this thing where you're going, I have to fight for the innocence of my children because you are literally the only person who will fight for their innocence. Nobody else in the entire world will fight for your kid's innocence but you.
Yeah, and that's it's the challenge of the Christian faith is that not everybody has the same things that they're willing to fight for. So while you're fighting for your children's innocence and you're trying to preserve that innocence through kind of that internet protection and you probably have friends that would say, yeah, I mean, we let our kids kind of do whatever.
Yeah.
It's not a battle we're willing to fight. So now you're fighting a battle to protect your kids and they're friends with people that you're friends with. And they're like, yeah, we're not willing to fight that battle. And so then it's difficult. And then you're like, okay, should we keep fighting this battle or just let it go?
Yeah. And it's hard to explain to kids that it's like different people have different convictions because even like what we talk about where we don't really celebrate Halloween and it's like, my kids in one breath will drive down the street and everybody's got these elaborate decorations and they're like, this is scary. It's scaring me. And I'm like, and they're like, why can't we celebrate Halloween? I'm like, you just said.
Yeah, exactly.
It was scaring you.
Yeah. And even now, so that's something I'm pretty adamant about. Like I don't preach sermons much about it, but I'm pretty adamant about Halloween and we don't celebrate it and there's nothing good about it. Yet there are people, in our church, good people, like I love them and care, but they're like, it's not a big deal. Halloween is not a big deal. I'm like, it is because there's nothing really about Halloween. Like I had one person say, oh, it's about being generous and handing out candy. Well, be generous in September or something.
Right.
Just invite kids over and give them candy. That's not what Halloween is about. Right. So I'm willing to fight for that to say, no, there is nothing inherently good in this celebration. It's all about witches and evil. And
I've never seen a baby Jesus in a manger at Halloween.
Yeah. It's just nothing points towards Christ. And so I'm willing to stand on that and to fight for that. And other people are like, oh, you're just being over the top and I'm not willing to fight that. And okay, but I am. So how much fight do you have in you and what are you willing to fight for? Because those things really do reflect kind of your core values, who you are as a person.
But I think everybody has different convictions too, because like you said, I'll be sitting there going, we don't celebrate Halloween and we lock down the internet. And then, somebody will be like, but you let your kids watch Star Wars? I'm like, oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely I do. And it's like everybody has their own rationale and justification for it. So I'm fully willing to admit, I'm like, different people are convicted about different things. But it's really that thing. You said three things that we were fighting, which is the world, the devil, and the flesh.
Right.
And whatever you're picking, like I think that different people pick different things because they're different convicted. But to me, I think that principle of even having the wherewithal and the know-how to do battle, I think is so important because like when you're talking about battling your own flesh, like we're talking about, I have a craving, which we've talked previously on the podcast that this is why fasting is so important to teach your flesh.
Right.
I'm in charge. It's not my flesh that dictates my behavior. I dictate my flesh. And then the world, which is what we just kind of talked about, fighting culture, and then fighting the devil. Like we actually have spiritual powers and an enemy that we fight. So where do you see Christians really like culturally like ready to fight on some things, and where do you see us kind of like, no?
Yeah. So as I get started, let me just put a plug for a book that we read as a staff. The title of the book is "Live No Lies." Can you help me on the author? Is it John Mark Comer?
Yes.
Is that right? So
John Mark Comer, Live No Lies.
Yep. Live No Lies. Recommend the book. I thought it was a good book. I enjoyed it. Very insightful.
It's available wherever John Mark Comer books are sold.
Exactly. And so it does address those three things. It addresses the world, the flesh, and the devil, and the battles that take place in those realms. So where are we willing to fight and not fight? I would say that within the realm of Christianity as a whole, we are becoming less and less willing to fight culture. It's kind of scary, but people are just kind of leaning into culture, and we want to be just like them. So there's a trend to let down some guards with culture. Just let culture in. Whatever culture's doing, it's fine. And again, there's a balance. Like all of culture is not bad, but when it starts to contradict or come in direct conflict with the Word of God, then that's where a line has to be drawn. And unfortunately, in the Christian world, those lines are getting way more blurred than they have in the past. And so I think we're unwilling in some ways to fight culture, and we just lean into it and accept it.
Well, I think some of that too might because, I mean, I see that as well. And I think that might because I feel like culture used to be more aligned with Christian values, of course, like 1920s, 1930s, you know, like it was really, we were a Christian nation, you know, and most people, even if they did not have a vibrant relationship with God, prayed before their meals, they went to church even just to put on a show, you know, like, but it was an expectation in culture that you were a good Christian person. Like that was, if you ran for office, you had better be a church-going person. And now it's like, you know, those people are the enemy. And it's like, well, I attend the Church of Satan. Oh, how progressive of you.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, so like culture, you know, in some ways, like people have said that to me where they're like, oh, you're like, you know, far conservative. And I'm like, no. I just haven't moved. Like culture has moved away from.
I'm right where I've always been.
Yeah. The people that used to be in the middle are now, you know, far right or what. And so it's just like those things where it's like culture, as it moves away from Christianity and Christian values, I think it becomes more like, it becomes harder and harder because it used to be easier to sort of be in the culture and be a Christian because they had reflective values. But the more that culture departs from that, you just become very strange.
Yeah. And I won't go too far into this with any detail, but I just met with a person, does not go to our church, struggling with even their belief in God. So anyway, but we had a conversation, and in the conversation, this person told me that these bad things have happened to them, and they're really frustrated and don't understand it. And so I said, just let me ask you a real basic question: how would you characterize yourself? Like, are you a good person or a not good person? And they said, oh, I'm a good person. I try to live a moral life and do good things.
Right.
And then I slipped into that very basic, I know it seems cliche and a little weird, but I just said, all right, so have you ever stolen anything?
Right.
And he's like, yeah. And I said, so what do you call people who steal things? And he said, a thief. Yeah. Have you ever lied about it? Yeah. And what do you call people that liars? And so I just went through that whole list and then said, so basically you're a liar, a thief, an adulterer, but yet you're saying you're moral.
I'm a good person.
I'm a good person. So culture has shifted to say, well, we're all good people. Like we're just good people. Like in what you do and what you say, it's like it's because you're good. And then when I said you're a liar, a thief, an adulterer, and he's like, well, you got a point there. It's like, maybe, wait a minute, I need to rethink this because maybe I'm not as good as I think I am.
Well, and I feel like the more that culture slips, the more, quote unquote, the veil gets pulled back, where it's like, it used to be, oh, I'm battling against, my flesh or the culture. Like the flesh and the culture right now has converged into the fact that it's basically like who you take into your bed is now your entire identity.
Yeah.
And it's like, and we go, well, that's not a spiritual battle. That's biology. It's this. And I'm like, and then I've gone on websites that are promoting LGBTQ stuff. I've gone on, things that it's like feminism. And there's always a section that it's like, also, here's a link to the Church of Satan. Here's the, and I'm like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah. How are these connected?
Yeah. And we've talked about that before. A lot of times a pride parade is not people in business suits walking down, Fifth Avenue holding hands. There's always this spiritual component to it. And it's like, those are the things that I think that all three of these things, especially in our culture right now, are converging in the fact that culture is telling you, you are your cravings. Whatever you crave, you should give into that. You should celebrate it.
Yeah.
And it's become your spiritual identity.
Yeah. And then that's where, so we talked about culture, and that's what culture is saying. Your feelings trump facts.
Right.
Like whatever you feel is more important than the truth. And so then the flesh, like, because we're all craving those evil desires, we all wrestle. I mean, the Bible's very clear that we're never free from the struggle of doing what our flesh wants to do as opposed to following and doing what God wants it to do. And so when culture is saying, this is what you should have, and we're unwilling to fight culture, well, then our flesh rises up, and then we're like, well, I'm not willing to fight my flesh because it's in alignment with what culture is saying. Right. So this feels good. Culture is supporting it. And then the devil, like, now that line is blurred, and the devil's like, oh, yeah, you should. And so that attack comes, and we're like, well, I'm not even willing to fight the enemy in areas that I once held very firmly to, that this is a spiritual truth. And now I'm not even willing to fight that battle because what the devil is saying lines up with what I feel, which lines up with what culture is saying, you should do this. And now I'm not willing to fight for any of those things.
And I'm not willing to defend a God that doesn't necessarily agree with my flesh.
Yeah. And so, unfortunately, in the Christian world as a whole, there seems to be less and less passion about fighting for the truth of the gospel, of Scripture, and we've blurred those lines.
Well, and I think you and I have talked about this before. There's an expectation. And I was just talking about this with my young adult group. There's an expectation from Christians sometimes, I think, where it's like we pray for something, we're tempted, and we overcome that temptation. And then we go, good, I'll never have to do this again. I'll never have to fight the devil again. Maybe you even go through something traumatic like a death or a divorce or anything like that, and you come through the other side and you're like, oh, man, what a trial that was. Now I'm strong in my faith. I will never, have to fight again. And I was telling my group, I was like, man, that's crazy. I said, that would be like if you had a knee injury and we went into an MMA fight, if you and I were fighting and I knew that you had a knee injury and you're like, I went through recovery, I went through rehab. The first thing that I'm going to do when we step into the ring,
I'm going after that knee.
I'm going to kick that knee, and I'm going to kick it multiple times. And then if it turns out that you don't immediately buckle, I'm like, then we're going to fight. Then I'm going to try something else. Then I'm going to swing at your face. And then about half, I'm going to take a couple swings. Then I'm going to go, check on that knee again. And because people are like, especially in Freedom, a lot of times we'll deal with something and they'll go, man, I kicked this thing. I didn't even have a craving for 3-4 weeks. And all of a sudden yesterday, I just really wanted to drink. And I'm like, well, yeah, man, he's just checking that knee. And you went through, rehabilitate, like you are ready to say, no, that my knee is not going to buckle, but it's like, but he's going to check it every once in a while.
Yeah, I always refer to it as the Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom example. You remember that?
No.
Yeah. So
what is that?
When I was a kid, there was this show called the Mutual of Omaha. They sponsored this thing called Wild Kingdom.
Was that the guy with the Kratt Brothers dad? I don't know.
No, I don't
Tell
know.
your story.
So anyway, they would just show these wild, these scenes from the safari, but they would always show like the gazelle trying to run away from the hyena, right? So this whole herd of gazelles that are out grazing, and then this hyena comes, or a pack of hyenas, And you can always tell when they start running after them and the gazelles scatter, there's always like one gazelle, like old crippled grandpa gazelle, that's like, I got a wounded leg and I can't outrun the hyena. And that's the one they get.
Yeah.
And that's my image of spiritual attack. It's like the enemy, this hyena pack, is looking at the gazelles, and they're like, we're going to chase after this pack. We know we can't catch most of them, but there's going to be someone that's wounded, somebody that's crippled, somebody that's not going to be able to outrun us, and that's what we're going after. And so the ones that are willing to fight will survive. The ones that are not willing to fight will get either wounded or killed, because that's the strategy of the enemy: kill, steal, or destroy.
So they're going to, that's that thing where I was thinking about that when you're like, are you willing to fight? It's like, yes, are you willing to fight, not just today, but continuously?
Yeah, so going back to that story from yesterday, when this conversation I was having with this person, I said, here's what it looks like to me. And you can think it's weird, but here's what it looks like to me. That you were wounded in battle. So you have some wounds, and you're laying on this battlefield, and Satan is bearing down on you, but somebody in your life grabbed you and pulled you and said, hey, I want to bring you to a place where you can recover, and you're trying to crawl back into the battlefield. Mm-hmm. I said, do you want to get healing, or do you want to go back out there and take more shots?
Right.
You have to decide, because the battle is raging around you, and it appears to me like you're making every excuse to crawl back into the battlefield to take on more fire into your life, instead of just continuing to let people help you find healing in your life. And so that's the truth. Are you willing to fight, or are you just going to crawl back into the battlefield and let the enemy kill you?
Right. Well, and Joshua, they're preparing. They're getting ready to cross the Jordan. And you were talking about, obviously the fact that they have to take the Ark of the Covenant into the river before the river stops upstream, which I always just think is funny, because it's like, I almost feel like it's like, well, God's not going to let the Ark drown. So like if you carry the Ark into the river, God's going to be like, whoa, don't touch the, don't touch the Ark. But I wrote down here a question that I was thinking about while you were preaching. And it was just kind of an interesting question to think about, which was, because when you were saying like, oh yeah, Joshua did his job, he went and he spied out the land, and he came back and gave a good report, and God's like, well, these people are not capable, they're not willing to go in and take the promised land, so we have to wander around the wilderness. And I think it was everybody above the age of 20 was going to die off. Let's say 12 or 20, whichever one it is. And so you literally, like, I'm just picturing, what is that like for Joshua, that he's like, well, Phil was 34 when I gave this report, and it's just a matter of time, he's like, hey, Joshua, and he's like, hey, Phil, just like,
you're not going to make it.
Is it going to be a snake bite? Is it going to be a battle? Like, what's going to happen here? And so he's tooling around, and so they have to wait till everybody dies in the wilderness. But when they come back and they're getting ready to part that river, like, I wonder what that was like, because, we're sitting there going, man, you got to step into the river and take that step out of faith. But I'm like, also, these are 40-year-olds that have never known a day in their life that they haven't picked manna up off the ground, and quail hasn't fallen from the sky to feed them, and they got water from a rock by talking to it. And it's like, these are the things that you're just like going, what would that be like for 40 years? I mean, it's even to the point where God has to tell them before they go out. I think it's in Deuteronomy where he said, hey, by the way, once you cross that river, there's no more manna. And I'm going, is that some ways like a motivator for them to take Jericho? Because they're like, there's nothing to eat.
Yeah.
Like, we got to go take the city. Absolutely. I'm starving. But what is that like for people? And I wrote down, because I felt like, the generation that couldn't go to the promised land, their generation was defined almost by slavery and suffering. They were in Egypt. They kept asking to go back to slavery. And then you have this new generation that's almost the manna generation, right? It's, they're defined by trusting the Lord daily. And so, that's what you have to do to go take that land. And so I'm going, what do you think the different generations, what were some of the defining things about our generations? Like, you're probably Gen X, right? Ish.
I'm a boomer.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. I'm at the very end of boomers.
You're probably in that transitionary phase.
So I think, I can't remember when boomers ended, 1964 or 5, somewhere in there. I was born before that. So
So I'm in that kind of transitional phase between Gen X and millennial. So and now we're seeing Gen Z come up. Like, what are you seeing as far as like what do you think some of the big rocks of those generations were?
I know it's when you generalize, there's some dangers in that.
Of course.
But for the boomers, so we're the generation that ultimately it could be said of us that we're the beginning of the problem, right? Of the millennial, when people say, "Oh, they're lazy," they're and have all these characterizations of millennials, which again, there are some truths, and it's terrible that you kind of characterize the whole generation from a few. But so the boomers, because we came from a culture, the World War II parents, the Korean War, when we didn't have anything, and then we started to get a little bit of material possessions and some freedoms. We are the ones who kind of intensified what our parents felt and said, we want our kids to have way more than what we had. And that's where that mindset started coming. We don't want them to do without. We don't want them to struggle with the same things we struggled with. And so we gave our kids everything that we thought they wanted.
Right.
And so then when that continues, then you have a generation that says, well, I should just get everything that I want. And so then you're not willing to fight for the things to get them because it's always just been given to you. And it was from a pure heart, like we genuinely want our kids to have more than we had, and to not make them struggle and do without. But as a result, then you have what's called the entitled, like we're entitled for all, of all of this. And so I think that's kind of what defines my generation, is the generation who just wanted our kids to have everything because we didn't.
Well, and as far as the church goes, like I think that your generation, I don't know what that would have been like. Like I remember as a kid watching some of the worship wars happen, some of the modernization of the church, which I assume that your generation probably would have been the adults at that time.
Yeah.
And so, I can see that almost reflected in that, where it's like it became the modernization of the church, but also then set the stage for, well, I want what I want out of a church, and it became more of a church hopping rather than a community. And then, like I said, our generation, I feel like, was almost a generation of rebellion. My generation is tattooed, it's pierced, it's, Gen X especially, but millennials less so. But we were more of the, I think, discontent, where you're seeing a lot of Gen X and millennial in those generations that even if you grew up in the church, they have to almost leave to miss like that community.
Yeah.
Like I would almost say it's like a prodigal generation, where it's like, we think that, maybe it's because we're spoiled and we got everything we want, and it's like, we almost had to go, well, this is dumb. And it's, and I even saw that in a discontentment from my own generation spiritually, which was surely, this church, has to be a better church, like the grass is greener kind of a thing. And then you leave and then you're like, well, wait a minute. All my friends were back here. All my, all the important spiritual moments that I had were at this church, and so it's almost this weird kind of thing where we're almost a generation that like we move on and then we regret.
Yeah. And so you bring what I just said about our generation into the church world. Mm-hmm. So our generation and then the generations before us, when it comes to church, for the most part, the church that you went to is the church that you always went to.
Right.
Like you stay there, and you don't always get along with everyone, but you figure it out in your family and you work through difficulties, and that's your church. And you do church together, you do life together. And they become family. And then now we're getting to a place, when you talked about church shoppers and hoppers, and well, now it's more of, well, this is what I want, this is what I feel, this is what I like, and so and we went through a phase, maybe we're still there, I don't know, you might know more but there was a phase where people would go to this church for a week or two because they really liked the preaching, but then they would go to this church for a week or two because they really liked the music, and they just kind of had a rotation of churches that they would go to, not really committed to any one particular church family. They just went to fill the need of, I like this and there, and I like that there, and you just jumped around, which is not a healthy, like, it's not a good mindset. It's not a good way to do life. You don't do that with your family, and so the church is supposed to be a reflection of God's family. And so, yeah, that's something that has changed over time from generation to generation.
So stepping out, you said, can be scary and illogical. How do you know when God is calling you to something or you're crazy? Because there's a lot of things.
Sometimes it's a really fine line. Yeah. And I don't know that I have a real firm answer other than you have to know the voice of God in your own life. You have to know the Word of God. You have to know what it feels like spiritually to walk with God and to sense His presence in your life, because He'll tell you if you're going the wrong way.
Right.
And you can ignore those things, or you can lean into them. But it's a fine line. It's not a precise science. And so, I can go back. So when we moved to Gardner in 2000, there were people who said, that's the dumbest thing you could do. They can't pay you. You're going to have no salary. You're going to sell your house in Lenexa, walk away from a church that wants to give you a job.
Right.
Is going to pay you to be a pastor. So I was an associate pastor at the church, and they're like, I wasn't getting paid there. It was just volunteer. And they said, we want to bring you on staff and pay you. But they understood, hey, here's an opportunity to go to Gardner. So they were supportive of that. But I chose to sell a house, move to Gardner, buy a house, and pastor a church that could not pay me any money.
Right.
And people are saying, why would you do that? And it was ultimately because I knew God said this is where He wanted me. And it was illogical. It made more sense to keep the security of where I was. I knew the people, I knew the church, they loved me. But this was something I knew God said to do. And so it was illogical, but I did it. And God provided. When we built our current facility in 2006, didn't make a lot of sense. People were like, how are we going to pay for it? I don't know. But this is what I feel like God is saying. And so we did. The same thing is true now when we're preparing to move into a new facility. It's well, are we going to have the finances? I don't know. It's up to God.
Well, and it's hard to describe that experience unless you've had it, where it's it's that certainty that comes from an outside source, where Chris and I experienced that when we moved to Kansas City. I told you about that, where I had a really cush job with my dad, and had just kind of gone through kind of a fight in the church, and we prevailed in that. We're okay, we're getting to it and just cruising along. And then all of a sudden it was this church planner had asked me to come down to Kansas City and interview for a job that I didn't really want. And, he's like, well, just he kept saying just talk to so-and-so, just talk to so-and-so, just get on a plane and come. And it was a 6-month process. And by the time I was here, we spent 24 hours here, and Chris and I laid down in a hotel bedroom, and I just turned to her, and we both kind of we already knew, but I had to speak. I'm like, we're going to move to Kansas City. And she went, yep. Yeah. It was just but it was this sense of peace, certainty. It was confirmed by somebody else that was in the situation with me. Those are all things that I think that.
Yeah. And I think the danger, people slip into this trap of thinking, oh, well, if it's God, then it's going to be easy. And if it's not easy, well, that's God saying, I'm shutting the door. And that's not always the case. Just like with the Israelites.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy to take the promised land, but it's what God wanted for them. So you have to know, even if it's difficult, is this what God is calling me to, even in the difficulty? And if it is, then He'll see you through it.
Well, and that's the thing. Because you say that, and I know the people that are the opposite way, where it's well, if it's easy to do, then it's not from God. And I'm well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And I'm this is whether it's easy or not, is not a factor.
No, it's not and this is not a precise science, right?
Yeah.
It is a spiritual walk with God and knowing him and letting him guide you.
And there might be course corrections in that as well.
Yep.
But I love, like I said, love the message. Can't wait for this next week. So join us back here on the 167 next week. If you enjoyed this episode of the 167, make sure you like, subscribe, follow, get notified, leave a 5-star rating and a positive review. Tell all your friends to listen as well. Make sure you go over to newlifegardener.com and check out all that we have to offer as a church, and check out our messages online as well. Thanks for listening.